Readings I discuss in this sermon are listed below in the description. I would suggest that you might want to read those before listening to the sermon. In today's lesson from the first book of Samuel, and also in the reading from the Gospel of John, we hear stories about people being called by God. Samuel's story is interesting. By way of background, his mother Hannah was much loved by her husband, but barren, unable to bear children. Now, the old priest Levi, or rather Eli, was sitting by the doorpost of the temple one day when he saw Hannah weeping profusely and praying to God with all her might that she might bear a son who she promised, in bargaining with God, would be given to God in service in return. She was bargaining with God. She was so overwrought with passion that Eli assumed she was probably drunk. Well, once they clarified that she was not drunk, Eli calmed her down and sent Hannah on her way with a very simple blessing: go in peace, and may God grant you what you have asked. After Hannah did surrender it all up and gave it up to God, God did grant Hannah's prayer. And when the boy was old enough, she did bring him back to the temple to serve Eli. And that is where this morning's reading begins. In the evening, in that place between the waking world and the stillness of sleep, Samuel suddenly hears the voice of the Lord calling him by name. Samuel gets up, goes to Eli, who he assumes has called him, and says, "You called?" Of course, Eli's an old man. He's trying to get to sleep himself, so he just sends him off back to bed. This happens 3 times before Eli finally catches on and says to Samuel, if you hear it again, stop and answer this way: "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." There's a couple of things that are worth noting about Samuel's encounter with the Lord. First, it never actually occurs to him that God is speaking to him, not until Eli suggests that maybe that's what's going on in his life. When things keep happening and keep happening and keep happening, maybe that's a time when we should stop and listen to God. Second, that place of stillness, that place between waking and sleeping, that's the place where we most commonly encounter God. In Samuel's case, he only heard God's voice at the end of the day, when all the busyness of the world was quieted down and he was ready for rest. Third, it really makes no difference at all that God is speaking to us if we don't, for our part, stop, still ourselves, and listen. One of the things I have learned in my own personal journey is that God is always speaking. I've also learned about myself that I, like Samuel, am seldom listening. My mind, like Samuel's, is mostly tuned into the world, where I am, what I'm supposed to be doing, what I'm supposed to be thinking about, concerned about, what I think should be going on, what should be happening. And like Samuel, I have learned that what I need to do is enter that place of stillness, to turn my attention away from the world, towards God, and listen. The importance of listening, of stilling our thoughts and passions before God, and simply resting in our faith, the faith that God's got this. It cannot be overemphasized how important that is if you really want to learn how to pray. That's why when we are able to come together in worship, we always suggest that people be quiet when they come into the sanctuary before worship, in order to prepare themselves to enter into God's presence and pay attention to what God may have to say. Inner stillness is vital to Christian discipleship. The Gospels tell us that even Jesus needed to go off by himself into the wilderness to find the stillness where he could rest his attention in God and pray. Now, to be fair, in these days we're living in, it is hard to still the soul. The world that we're living in is so full of tumult, so much full of tumult that it would be easy to let it dominate our attention, so that really we're unable to rest at all, much less rest in God's peace. If the story of Samuel's calling stands for anything, it stands for the proposition that if you want to attune yourself to God's will, you must still your own desires, your own will, and listen. In today's gospel lesson, we hear the story about the calling of Nathanael. Now, Nathanael, we are told, is from Cana, which is that little village where Jesus is shortly going to do his first miracle in John's gospel, turning water into wine. Nathanael is not mentioned at all in the other three Gospels, and the tradition of the church has always assumed that Nathanael is the same person known as the son of Ptolemaeus, or Bartholomew, in the other Gospels. Now, at this point in the story, two of John the Baptist's disciples have decided to follow Jesus and see what he's about. One of those disciples, Andrew by name, introduces Jesus to his brother, Peter. And Jesus and these three disciples then go to Bethsaida, which is the hometown of Peter and Andrew, where Jesus then meets Philip and invites him to come and see what it is he is all about. And that brings us up to the story we read this morning, where Philip goes to Nathanael and says, "We have discovered the one written about by Moses in the law and by the prophets, Jesus, the son of Joseph, who is from Nazareth." Now, Nathanael is clearly not impressed. His response to Philip's news is, "Pshaw! Something good can come out of Nazareth?" Now, today he might say, "Horse feathers," or I bet you would use a different word. But Jesus loved it. He says, "Behold, an Israelite in whom there is no guile." We'd say that differently today as well. We'd say, "Why, this guy here, he doesn't put up with any horse feathers." From his praise of Nathanael, I think we can discern that Jesus has a fondness for people who are skeptical, who like to find things out for themselves, even when they're skeptical of him. Now, Nathanael, of course, eventually changes his tune about Jesus when he discovers how deeply Jesus actually knows him, which is symbolized in this gospel story by that little bit about Jesus seeing Nathanael under the tree at a point when he couldn't possibly have seen him. Now, back to the first story, Samuel, in his encounter with the Lord, was being called to the priesthood of Israel, and he's eventually going to become the priest who anoints David as king. Now, Nathanael the skeptic is not being called to become a priest, but to become a disciple, to put his skeptical mind to work in the service of the Lord. Of the two, being called to the priesthood and being called to discipleship is harder. There is not a priest or a pastor whom I have ever met who will not tell you that their baptism, not their ordination, was the most important and life-changing moment of their lives. Now, ordination to a particular job in service to the church, such as deacon, priest, or bishop, is just that. It's being set aside to do a particular job. Discipleship, and in particular the discipline of baptism, continually dying to self and rising in Christ, that's harder. And it's hard whether you're a priest, a lawyer, a student, a homemaker, a factory worker, a teacher, an engineer. It is extraordinarily hard for any of us to surrender all our troubles and even surrender our own desires, our own wills, to the will of God. Not my will, but thy will be done. In times like we're living in, it's hard to take our eyes off the news cycle and to intentionally make space in our lives to rest our souls in God's presence, because to do so requires that we die to self. We have to surrender all our worries, all our concerns, even our desires to God. Being a disciple, taking up the cross and dying to self, requires that we commit ourselves to the path of loving our enemies, of turning the other cheek, of not judging others, and all those other really difficult things that go along with being a disciple of Jesus Christ, including those qualities that Paul lays out for us in 1 Corinthians 13, being patient, being kind, not being jealous or pompous, not being self-inflated or rude, not seeking our own interests or imposing our own values on others, not being quick-tempered, not brooding over injuries we suffered, not rejoicing in wrongdoing, but always rejoicing in truth. I can't think of a single one of those qualities that you could use to describe me while I'm watching the news or reading the news. And that's true even though I know that none of what I'm watching is ever going to get better for me or anybody else until I give up judging other people's character and motives, until I learn to turn the other cheek, and until I learn to love my enemies, because that is the only way things will ever change. It's important for us Christians to remember, by the way, that there is a difference between judging people's character and their motives and judging people's actions. In the interest of justice, we all have to be judged for our actions, and actions must have consequences, and they do. But in the interest of mercy, and in the interest of walking humbly with God, we have to give up judging the motives and characters of others in order to accomplish what it is that God desires to accomplish between us. Namely, that his children should live together reconciled to one another and loving one another. The world desperately needs us to latch on to that. Not to being a Democrat, not to being a Republican, but being a Christian. It needs that now, and it needs it desperately. It's hard for any of us to set aside our own feelings, our own hopes, sometimes even our own sense of right and wrong, just to present ourselves before God in an effort to sincerely be still and sincerely listen. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Most of the time, don't we come to prayer not to listen to God, but instead to tell him what we want, what we think ought to be happening, tell him what we think God ought to be doing next? After making a spectacle of herself at the temple, Samuel's mother, Hannah, gave it all up. She surrendered herself to God's will and God's purposes in her life. And in the end, she left her troubles behind with that simple prayer, "Let your servant find favor in your sight." After that, it is said that she went home, ate and drank with her husband, and her countenance was sad no more. Then, as often happens once we give up and surrender to God's will, she became pregnant with Samuel. Now Nathanael, or as he was otherwise known, Bartholomew, ultimately surrendered everything to follow Jesus. Tradition says that he brought the good news of God's love to India, and then to Armenia, where he was either crucified upside down or else flayed alive and beheaded, depending on which story you might prefer. So, from a worldly standpoint, it doesn't sound like being a disciple of Jesus is such a great idea or a very good deal. A whole lot of his followers wind up dead. But the truth is, we all wind up dead, whether we're a follower of Jesus or not. The difference is, as Jesus says at the end of Matthew, he that endures in the path of love to the end, he's going to find salvation. It is always worth the effort to endure in love. It doesn't just make the world better, it makes our lives fulfilling and complete. We have endured a lot over the past months, and probably especially over the past 2 weeks. We know that there's going to be much more to endure in the weeks and the months ahead. Now, we can let it just all run wild in our heads, and if we do, our hearts are going to become every bit as wild and unruly as the world that we live in. Or we can discipline ourselves, still ourselves in the presence of God, and listen. We can surrender all this mess to God and give it over to his will. Then and only then, even in the middle of this storm, we can know peace. And only from that space of peace are we going to be able to find the strength we need to be Jesus' disciples, to love God, to love our neighbor, and to change the world. Speak, Lord, for your servants are listening.